The Sounds in the Darkness, a TLW original documentary acti, The Setting of the Soul. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over farmland after dark. It's not the absence of sound, nothing living ever truly falls silent, but rather a different quality of presence. The world shifts into something older, more honest. The pretenses we carry through daylight hours seem to dissolve when the sun drops below the horizon, and what remains is something closer to truth. I've worked this land for 43 years, inherited it from my father, who inherited it from his. 3 generations of Morrisons have watched seasons turn on these 200 acres of central Kansas soil, have felt the rhythms of planting and harvest become as familiar as their own heartbeats. My grandfather used to say that a man doesn't own land. He just borrows it for a while, tries to leave it better than he found it. I think about that often now, especially in the evenings when the weight of years settles into my bones and the farmhouse feels larger than it should. The autumn of my 67th year had been mild, the kind of season that tricks you into forgetting winter is coming. The wheat had come in strong that summer, better than we'd seen in nearly a decade, and I'd spent most of September watching the combines move across neighboring fields like great mechanical insects, their lights cutting through the dust at twilight. My own harvest was already in, the advantages of a smaller operation, my wife Sarah used to say, back when there was still a we to speak of. Sarah had been gone 3 years by then. Cancer took her in stages, the way it takes so many. First her energy, then her appetite, then the light behind her eyes. I'd sat beside her bed those final weeks, holding hands worn smooth by decades of shared work, and when she passed, it was quietly, between one breath and the next, like a candle guttering out in a room that had grown too still. The house remembers her better than I sometimes do. The curtains she chose still hang in the kitchen windows. Her gardening gloves still sit on the shelf by the back door, stiff now with disuse. I've thought about packing away her things, making the space feel less like a museum to what we'd built together, but every time I start, I find I can't finish. Some things aren't meant to be boxed up and stored. Some absences need to remain present. It was October when the noises started. The 3rd week, I think, though the days had begun to blur together the way they do when you live alone, and the only conversations you have are with cattle and the occasional neighbor who stops by to check that you haven't fallen into your own well. The nights were cooling rapidly by then, the kind of cold that makes you grateful for heavy blankets and the old wood stove in the living room that my father had installed the year I was born. I'd gone to bed early that first night, the way I usually did. There's no point staying up when there's no one to talk to, no late-night movie you both pretend to watch while really just enjoying the warmth of another body nearby. I was deep in that half-sleep that comes easily to those who work with their hands, dreaming of nothing in particular, my body heavy against the mattress, when something woke me. At first, I couldn't place it. The farmhouse makes its own sounds at night, settling foundations, wind against weathered siding, the occasional complaint of pipes expanding and contracting with temperature changes. You learn the music of your home the way you learn anything else, through repetition, through attention, through years of sleeping under the same roof. This was something different. The barn sat 300 yards from the house, a massive structure that had been built during my grandfather's time when the operation was larger and the family needed space for horses, dairy cattle, and equipment that has long since rusted into memory. We'd scaled back over the decades, just beef cattle now, 30 head that barely required half the space, but the barn remained, too much a part of the property's bones to tear down, too expensive to maintain properly. Sarah had wanted to convert part of it into an event space, maybe host weddings or community gatherings. Another dream that had remained just that. The sound was coming from the barn. I was certain of it, even through the fog of interrupted sleep, a rhythmic creaking, like weight shifting on old floorboards, then silence, then the sound again. I lay there for a long while, listening, telling myself it was probably nothing. A board loosened by the day's wind, a raccoon investigating the grain bins, one of the barn cats knocking something over in its nighttime hunting. The explanations lined up in my mind like soldiers, each one reasonable, each one easier to accept than the alternative. But there's a knowing that comes with age, a quiet certainty that bypasses logic and speaks directly to instinct. Something was in my barn that didn't belong there, and lying in bed, pretending otherwise, wasn't going to change that fact. Act 2, the first turning of the trail. I didn't go out that first night, called myself a coward for it later, though Sarah would have said I was being sensible. 67 years old, alone on an isolated farm, the nearest neighbor a quarter-mile away, and likely asleep. Whatever was making those sounds would still be there in the morning, or it wouldn't. Either way, I'd face it better, rested, and in daylight. Dawn came slow and grey, the way it does in late October when the world seems reluctant to fully wake. I made coffee in the percolator Sarah had insisted on keeping even after everyone else switched to drip machines. She said it tasted better, and she was right, and stood at the kitchen window watching the barn emerge from darkness. From here it looked the same as it always had, weathered red paint fading to a kind of russet brown, the hayloft doors slightly askew where one hinge had given out years ago, and I'd never gotten around to fixing it. Nothing looked disturbed, no vehicles I didn't recognize, no obvious signs of intrusion. The cattle were grazing in the near pasture like it was any other morning, steam rising from their backs in the cool air. If something had been in the barn overnight, it had either left or hidden itself well. I pulled on my boots and jacket, grabbed the flashlight from beside the door, habit, even though it was light enough now, and walked out across the yard. The ground was firm with frost, grass crunching softly underfoot. The barn's main doors were closed the way I'd left them, the padlock still in place. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing but the distant complaint of a crow and the gentle sounds of cattle. The side door told a different story. I'd stopped using it years ago when the frame warped and it became difficult to open, but someone had worked at it recently. The wood around the latch was splintered fresh, pale against the weathered grey. Not forced violently, more like pried carefully by someone who didn't want to make noise. My heart rate picked up, though I tried to tell myself there was probably a simple explanation. Homeless drifter looking for shelter. Local teenagers using the abandoned portion of my barn for whatever teenagers used abandoned buildings for these days. Something to report to the sheriff, get sorted out, forget about by next week. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The barn smelled the way it always did, old hay and dust and the faint sweetness of grain, the accumulated scent of decades of agricultural work layered into the wood itself. Light filtered through gaps in the siding, cutting pale stripes across the dirt floor. Most of the main level was storage now, old equipment under tarps, bales of hay stacked against the far wall, the empty stalls where we'd once kept horses. I walked slowly, flashlight beams sweeping across familiar territory, made suddenly strange by the possibility of hidden presence. Nothing seemed out of place, no obvious signs that anyone had been here. I was beginning to feel foolish, an old man spooked by night sounds and an overactive imagination, when I noticed the ladder to the hayloft. The rungs had been wiped clean, not completely, but enough that the usual layer of dust was disturbed. Someone had climbed up there recently. I should have called the sheriff right then. That's what any sensible person would have done, what Sarah certainly would have insisted upon. But something held me there at the base of that ladder, some instinct I couldn't name. Maybe it was the careful way the door had been pried. Not the work of someone dangerous, I thought, but someone desperate. Maybe it was the memory of my own son at 16, restless and angry at the world, running off for 3 days before we found him sleeping in a friend's car outside Wichita. Michael had been gone 12 years now. Karsat. Accident on the interstate, 2 weeks after his 34th birthday. We'd buried him next to my parents in the church cemetery, and I'd stood there watching dirt fall on the casket, thinking that no one should ever have to outlive their child. It's an inversion of the natural order, a wound that doesn't heal so much as scar over enough to let you function. "Hello?" I called up toward the hayloft. My voice sounded strange in the barn's stillness, too loud and too old. "I know someone's up there. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk." Silence, but a different kind now, the held-breath silence of something living trying not to be noticed. "My name's Earl," I continued, feeling slightly ridiculous. "Earl Morrison. This is my farm. I'm not looking for trouble. If you need help, maybe I can provide it. If you're just passing through, that's fine too, but I'd rather know who's sleeping in my barn than wonder about it." I waited. The barn creaked in the wind. Dust motes swirled in the light, and then, so quietly I almost missed it, a voice from above. "Please don't call the police." Young, male, scared. All of that came through in those 5 words. And suddenly I wasn't standing in my barn anymore. I was back in that parking lot outside Wichita, looking at my own son's face through a car window, seeing fear and defiance and something underneath both that might have been hope. "I'm not calling anyone just yet," I said. "Why don't you come down here where I can see you? I've got coffee up at the house. Breakfast too if you're hungry." A long pause, then movement, the creak of boards, the rustle of hay. A figure appeared at the top of the ladder, silhouetted against the light from the loft doors. Small, thin. The kind of thin that speaks of meals missed and growth stunted. He climbed down slowly, keeping his eyes on me the whole way, like he was expecting me to grab him the moment he was within reach. When he stepped off the last rung and turned to face me fully, I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite recognition, but something close to it. He couldn't have been more than 14, maybe 15. Dark hair that needed cutting, hanging into eyes that held the kind of wariness you don't see in children who've been treated kindly. His clothes were wrong for the weather, a thin hoodie over a t-shirt, jeans worn through at the knees, no jacket. On his cheek, fading to yellow at the edges, was a bruise the size of a man's fist. "What's your name, son?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. He hesitated, weighing options, I realized, deciding whether to trust me with even that much. "Eli," he finally said. "My name's Eli." Act 3, The Hard Miles. He ate like he hadn't seen food in days, which, as it turned out, was close to the truth. I'd made eggs and bacon, toast from bread I'd baked 2 days earlier, one of the skills I'd had to learn after Sarah passed, though mine never came out quite as good as hers. Eli sat at my kitchen table and worked through 3 plates before slowing down, his body visibly relaxing as it received what it had been denied. I didn't push him to talk at first. There's a patience required when dealing with wounded things, animals or humans. It's the same basic principle. You create space. You let them come to you on their own terms. Anything else feels like threat, triggers the flight instinct that's kept them alive this long. The story came out in pieces over the next few hours, then days. Eli was 15, though he looked younger. Malnutrition will do that to a developing body. He'd been in the foster care system since age 8, when his mother had died of an overdose and no relatives had come forward to claim him. 7 years, 4 different placements, The last one, with a family in Hutchinson, had been the worst. The man, Eli never called him his foster father, just the man, had started hitting him within the first month. Small things at first, the kind of violence that could be explained away as discipline, but it had escalated, the way such things always do when there are no consequences to hold them in check. The bruise I'd seen on his face was the most recent evidence, delivered 3 nights ago after Eli had failed to finish his chores to the man's satisfaction. "I tried telling my caseworker," Eli said quietly, staring at his empty plate. "Twice. She said she'd look into it. Nothing changed. The man found out I'd talked, and it got worse." He paused, something flickering across his face. Shame, maybe, or anger too deep for a child to properly express. "So I left, took what I could carry and started walking. Figured anywhere was better than there. He'd been on the road for 4 days when he found my barn, sleeping in fields, behind gas stations, anywhere that offered minimal shelter from the October nights. He'd chosen my place because it looked abandoned from the road, the faded paint, the overgrown fence line I kept meaning to clear. Just another forgotten farm in a landscape full of them. I listened to all of this with a heaviness settling into my chest. We live in a world that claims to protect its children, that has systems and processes and professionals dedicated to their welfare. And yet here sat a boy who had slipped through every safety net, whose cries for help had disappeared into bureaucratic silence, who had been failed so completely by the adults responsible for his care that his best option had been to run into the October cold with nothing but the clothes on his back. "What happens now?" Eli asked, and I could hear the fear underneath the question. He'd let his guard down, told me his story, and now he was bracing for the inevitable betrayal, the phone call to authorities, the return to a system that had already proven it wouldn't protect him. I looked at him across the table, this wounded child who had ended up in my barn by accident or providence or whatever forces guide lost souls toward unexpected harbors. And I thought about Michael, about all the conversations we'd never had, all the years stolen by that moment on the interstate. I thought about Sarah, who had always wanted grandchildren, who had died with that hope unfulfilled. I thought about the empty rooms of this farmhouse, the silence that had become my constant companion. "Now," I said slowly, "we figure out how to keep you safe, properly safe. That's going to mean involving some people. I'm not going to lie to you about that, but I'm not sending you back to that house, and I'm not letting anyone put you somewhere else that's just as bad. You understand?" He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes, the wariness that hadn't fully left, the expectation of disappointment that had been taught to him through years of broken promises. But there was something else too, something fragile, that might have been the beginning of hope. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you help me?" It was a fair question. The world had given him no reason to trust kindness, no evidence that strangers would help without wanting something in return. "Because someone should have helped you a long time ago," I said. "Because I've got space and time and no one to share either with. Because—" I paused, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. "Because I had a son once. He's gone now. But I remember what it felt like to worry about him, to want to protect him from everything hard in the world. Every kid deserves someone who worries about them like that. If there's no one else for you, then maybe it can be me." Eli looked at me for a long moment. Then, quietly, he nodded. What followed was the hardest 2 weeks of my life since Sarah's funeral. I called a lawyer in town, Tom Hendricks, who'd handled our will, and explained the situation. He told me I was potentially looking at harboring a runaway, interfering with the foster system, a dozen other legal complications. I told him I didn't care. He sighed, said he'd make some calls, see what could be done. The county got involved, then the state. A different caseworker came out, a woman named Patricia, who actually seemed to listen, who looked at the documentation of Eli's injuries with something approaching horror. She interviewed him separately, then together with me, taking notes that filled page after page. The foster family in Hutchinson was investigated. I wasn't privy to the details, but I heard later that they'd been removed from the program, that other children in their care had come forward with similar stories once someone finally bothered to ask the right questions. A small victory, though it came years too late for Eli and however many others had passed through that house before him. Through all of it, Eli stayed at the farm. The state granted emergency temporary custody. Tom worked whatever magic lawyers worked to make that happen, and we settled into an awkward routine. He helped with morning chores, though I had to teach him everything from scratch. He ate meals at my table, slept in Michael's old room, watched television in the evenings while I read in my chair the way Sarah and I used to. He didn't trust me, not really. That would take time, if it came at all. But he was eating regularly for the first time in years, sleeping through the night without one ear open for danger, learning what it felt like to exist in a space where no one was going to hit him. Small things, perhaps, but for a child who'd been denied even those basic certainties, they were everything. Act 4. The Reckoning of Truth. The news crews arrived in November. I'm still not entirely sure how the story got out. Probably someone at the county office who talked to the wrong person, or maybe Tom mentioned it to a reporter friend. Either way, by the first week of November, there were vans parked outside my property with satellite dishes on top and people with cameras asking to talk to the farmer who rescued the foster child. I hated it. The attention, the intrusion, the way they talked about Eli like he was a character in a story rather than a real child with real wounds. I turned them all away at first, kept the gate locked, let the answering machine handle the calls. But they were persistent, and eventually Tom convinced me that controlled engagement was better than the alternative. This could help other kids, he said. Eli's not the only one falling through the cracks. If his story shines a light on the problems in the system, maybe things change. Maybe the next Eli gets caught earlier, gets placed somewhere safe from the start. I talked to Eli about it, really talked, the way I was learning to do, not telling him what we were going to do, but asking what he thought, what he wanted. He was quiet for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at the bare trees beyond the yard. "Will it help?" he finally asked. "Not me. I mean, will it help the other kids? The ones still in places like where I was?" "It might," I said honestly. "No guarantees, but sometimes when people see a face, hear a story, it makes them care about things they'd otherwise ignore. It makes it real." He nodded slowly. "Then okay. If it might help someone else, then okay." The interview that aired nationally was with a correspondent from one of the major networks. They came to the farm, shot footage of the barn, the fields, the house. They filmed Eli helping me feed the cattle, though his face was kept partially obscured to protect his privacy. And they sat me down in my living room, surrounded by Sarah's curtains and family photographs and all the accumulated evidence of a life lived, and asked me to tell the story. I'm not a natural speaker. Years of farming don't prepare you for cameras and careful questions and the knowledge that millions of people might eventually hear your words. But I did my best to explain about the noises in the night, about finding Eli in the hayloft, about the choice that hadn't really felt like a choice at all. "What made you help him?" the correspondent asked. "Most people would have just called the authorities." I thought about the question for a moment. The cameras waited. Somewhere behind them, Eli was probably watching, listening. The authorities had already failed him, I said finally. Calling them would have meant sending him back into a system that had hurt him over and over again. Sometimes doing the right thing means not following the rules. Sometimes it means trusting your gut over your head. I paused, feeling the weight of Sarah's absence beside me, the ghost of my son in the room beyond. I lost my wife 3 years ago, my son 12 years before that. This house has been empty a long time. When I found Eli in that barn, scared and hungry and hurting, I saw a chance to fill some of that emptiness, not to replace what I'd lost. Nothing can do that. But to make something new, something that might matter. The segment aired in late November, right before Thanksgiving. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters arrived at the farm by the hundreds, then thousands. People sharing their own stories of the foster system. Children who had aged out with nowhere to go. Parents who had tried to adopt and been defeated by bureaucracy. Former foster children now grown who recognized their own experiences in Eli's story. The state launched a review of its foster care oversight procedures. Congressional representatives called for hearings. Advocacy groups that had been fighting for reform for years suddenly found themselves with a public hungry to listen. Eli's story, our story, had become something larger than either of us, a focal point for conversations that had needed to happen for decades. Through it all, life on the farm continued. The cattle needed feeding regardless of what was happening in the world beyond our fences. The fields required maintenance. Winter was coming, and there was work to do to prepare. Eli worked beside me through all of it. He was still quiet, still wary in ways that would probably take years to fully heal. But there were moments, a genuine laugh at something the dog did, a question about why we planted certain crops in certain fields, an evening when he asked if he could look through the photo albums of Michael as a kid. That suggested something was beginning to grow. Not trust, exactly. Maybe something more fragile than that. Maybe the first tentative roots of belonging. The adoption paperwork started in December. Tom had prepared me for a long process, months of evaluations and home visits and legal procedures. But the attention on our case had accelerated things, brought pressure to bear that might otherwise have been absent. By Christmas, I was officially Eli's foster parent, with adoption proceedings scheduled for the spring. We celebrated Christmas that year with a small tree in the living room, the first one I'd put up since Sarah died. Eli helped me string the lights, asked about the ornaments, listened as I explained which ones Sarah had collected, which ones had been Michael's favorites as a child. We weren't a family yet, not in the way that word usually means, but we were something. Two people who had found each other in the darkness, who were learning to share light. ACT 5, the trail behind us. The adoption was finalized on a Tuesday in April, 6 months after that first night of strange sounds from the barn. We stood in a courtroom in Wichita, me in a suit I hadn't worn since Sarah's funeral, Eli in new clothes we'd bought together for the occasion, and a judge made official what had already become true in every way that mattered. Eli Morrison. It looked strange on the paperwork at first, this joining of his name to mine. But strange things become familiar with time. That's one of the lessons farming teaches you, that change is constant, that what seems impossible today becomes ordinary tomorrow if you're willing to put in the work. The media attention faded eventually, as it always does. The news cycle moved on to other stories, other tragedies and triumphs demanding the public's limited attention. But the conversations that had started didn't entirely stop. The state implemented new oversight procedures for foster placements. The advocacy groups continued their work with new resources and new allies. Small changes, perhaps, in a system that needed wholesale reform, but small changes add up, given enough time. Eli started school that fall, the first formal education he'd had in over a year. It was hard for him. The social dynamics of high school are unforgiving, and he carried wounds that made connection difficult. But there were teachers who made extra effort, students who recognized something kindred in his careful distance, small acts of kindness that accumulated into something like acceptance. I watched him navigate all of it with a mixture of pride and worry that I suspect is simply what parenting feels like. Watched him fail tests and pass others, make friends tentatively and lose them, struggle with the gap between the education he should have had and the reality of where he was. Watched him grow taller over that first year, his body finally receiving the nutrition it needed, his frame filling out until he no longer looked like a strong wind might blow him away. We built routines, the two of us, morning chores before school, evening meals together at the kitchen table, weekends working the land, teaching him the rhythms of the seasons, the patience required to grow things in stubborn soil. He took to farming more naturally than Michael ever had. There was something in him that responded to the physicality of the work, the tangible results of effort applied over time. "Tell me about her," he asked one evening, and I knew without asking that he meant Sarah. We were sitting on the porch watching the sun go down, the way I used to sit with her in the years before illness stole those simple pleasures. So I did. Told him how we'd met, at a county fair dance when we were 17, how I'd spent 3 weeks working up the courage to ask her father for permission to court her. Told him about our wedding day, the rain that had threatened to ruin everything before clearing just as she walked down the aisle. Told him about the years of struggle and joy, the child we'd raised, the dreams we'd built together on this land that had been in my family for generations. "She would have liked you," I said, and meant it. "She always wanted grandchildren. Said this house was too big for just 2 people, needed young energy to fill it up. I think—" My voice caught, the way it still did sometimes when I thought too hard about her. "I think she would have been proud of both of us, for finding each other, for trying to make something good out of all the broken pieces." Eli was quiet for a long time. Then, without looking at me, he reached out and took my hand. Just for a moment, a connection offered and accepted, fragile as new growth in spring soil. It's been 3 years now since that October night when strange sounds brought me to the barn. Eli is 18, finishing his senior year, talking about agricultural college. The farm that I thought would end with me now has a future, someone to carry forward what my grandfather started and my father continued, and I've tried to maintain. I'm 70 now, feeling the years in my joints and my breathing, and the way evenings tire me more than they used to. But the loneliness that had become my constant companion has receded, replaced by something warmer. Not the life I'd planned, that died with Sarah, with Michael, with all the assumptions I'd once held about how my story would end, but a different life, an unexpected one, no less real for being unplanned. People still ask me sometimes about that night, about the decision to help rather than call authorities. They want it to mean something profound, want me to have access to wisdom that explains why I made the choices I made. The truth is simpler and more complicated than any wisdom I could offer. I was a lonely old man who heard something in the darkness and went to investigate. I found a scared boy who needed help that no one else had been willing to provide. I made a choice based on instinct and grief and the ghost of my own son, and some inarticulate sense that this was what the moment required of me. That's all. That's everything. The barn still stands 300 yards from the house, a little more weathered each year, its red paint fading further toward brown. Eli fixed the hayloft door hinge last summer, finally addressing the repair I'd put off for years. Sometimes I see him up there in the evenings, looking out over the fields the way I used to do as a young man, and I wonder what he's thinking, what futures he's imagining, what the view looks like through eyes that have seen both cruelty and kindness, that are learning slowly to trust that the kindness might last. We don't talk about the Titanic headlines anymore, the brief moment when our story belonged to the whole country. That's faded into the background of our lives, a chapter that mattered but doesn't define us. What matters now are the daily things, the chores completed together, the meals shared, the quiet evenings on the porch watching the sun go down, the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that constitute a life. Sarah used to say that love isn't a feeling so much as a practice, something you do every day in small ways until it becomes indistinguishable from who you are. I think she was right about that, as she was right about most things. I think about her every day, and Michael too, the family I lost making space in my heart for the family I found. Not replacement, never that, but expansion, the capacity to love growing larger through grief, making room for what comes next. The noises in the barn at night have never returned, just the normal sounds of a working farm, cattle settling, wind against weathered siding, the occasional owl hunting in the fields. But I'm grateful for those strange October sounds that started everything, grateful that something in me chose to investigate rather than ignore, grateful for the accident or providence that brought a wounded boy to my hayloft at the exact moment when we both needed to be found. Some roads don't lead anywhere, my grandfather used to say. They just teach you something on the way. But sometimes, rarely if you're lucky, a road you never planned to walk takes you exactly where you needed to be all along. To a barn in October darkness, to a boy who needed a father, to a life that isn't finished yet. That's the story, not how it ends, because stories about people never really end while they're still living them, but where we are now. Two people who found each other in the dark, still finding their way together in the light, still learning what it means to be family, still grateful for every ordinary day. The land remembers everything, even what we try to forget. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it gives us chances we never thought to ask for.